In the heart of ancient Rome, where marble shone under a pitiless sun and the roar of the crowd could drown out any prayer, there stood an arena built not for glory, but for death. The Colosseum, a monument to cruelty, to power, to the empire's insatiable hunger for entertainment. Every stone of that colossal structure was laid with the suffering of slaves, the sweat of captives, and the silence of those who had lost everything. Within its walls, thousands met their end, but for some, death was not the worst fate. For many of the captives, especially the women, what they endured in Rome's shadow was far more haunting than any sword's edge. The story of the gladiators is often told in the language of heroism, steel clashing, sand soaked in blood, and the thunderous applause of tens of thousands. But behind that noise lay the quiet horror of lives stripped bare of dignity. The men who fought were not volunteers. They were slaves, prisoners of war, criminals condemned to die for amusement, and among them were women, taken not for sport, but as spoils. They were paraded as trophies of conquest, objects in the theater of dominance that Rome called justice. Their every breath was a reminder of defeat, their every glance watched, their every step controlled. They were scattered like whispers among markets and camps. Some were forced to serve in the gladiatorial schools, not as fighters, but as attendants, healers, servants to the men who trained for death. The walls of those training grounds, called ludi, echoed with more than the clash of weapons. They echoed with the cries of exhaustion, the sound of chains dragged across stone floors, the gasps of those who could not bear another day. And within those walls, the captive women lived a half-life, neither alive with hope nor dead enough to rest. To the Romans, the spectacle of blood was not cruelty, it was celebration. The games were a reflection of empire itself, order emerging from chaos, life decided by the will of the crowd. But for the captives, the arena was a nightmare made real. The women who survived the battles of empire often found themselves forced to witness the deaths of their husbands, brothers, or sons in those same arenas. Imagine the silence of that moment, standing among cheering strangers as someone you loved was slaughtered for applause. They could not scream. They could not turn away, for to show grief in public was to invite punishment. Their hearts broke behind eyes trained to be expressionless. It was said that the blood of the defeated gave Rome its strength. The emperors claimed the games honored the gods, that they pleased Mars, the god of war, and entertained the spirits of the dead. But those justifications were illusions. In truth, the games were a tool of control. The crowd's joy at another's suffering reminded everyone who held power and who did not. For captive women, that knowledge was constant, etched into their very existence. They had no names, only labels. They were not daughters or mothers anymore, just property of the empire. Their past erased like footprints swept from the sand. In some records, ancient historians speak of gladiatresses, female gladiators, who fought in the arena. Their stories are rare, almost mythical. These women were paraded before the crowd as curiosities, mocked even as they displayed courage. They were trained to kill, but unlike men, their fights were spectacles of humiliation. They wore armor designed to expose rather than protect, to turn their suffering into a show. Though Rome eventually banned female combatants, the memory of their existence still lingers, a symbol of how far the empire would go to turn every life, every body, into entertainment. But not all captive women were seen in the arena. Many were kept in the underground tunnels beneath it, the hypogeum. There, the air was thick with the smell of blood and oil, torch smoke clinging to the walls. These tunnels were alive with movement. Gladiators waiting for their turn, beasts pacing in cages, slaves preparing the stage. The women worked among them, unseen but vital. They cleaned, carried, and tended to the wounded. They watched men march to certain death, their eyes hollow from knowing what awaited. Every scream above was followed by a moment of silence below, a silence that pressed against their hearts like a weight they could not lift. The gladiators themselves lived in a strange kind of prison. They were both despised and adored. To the crowds, they were heroes of violence, champions of spectacle. But inside, they were broken. Many of them had been captives once too. Some felt pity for the women around them. Others were too far gone, consumed by survival. Bonds formed in the darkness of those barracks. Quiet friendships, shared pain, a stolen word of comfort. Yet even that was dangerous. Trust was a luxury Rome did not allow its slaves to have. Informers lurked everywhere, and any sign of rebellion, even a whisper of sympathy, could mean death. To be a captive woman in that world was to live without tomorrow. Each sunrise brought the same routine: serve, obey, endure. Some were forced to watch executions, their presence used as a lesson. Others were sent to the markets, paraded for buyers who measured their worth in silver coins. The empire's appetite was vast, and so was its cruelty. But what made their suffering worse than death was not the pain. It was the erasure of self. Death, at least, offered finality, but these women were denied even that. They were kept alive only to be broken again and again. There are rare accounts of defiance, small acts of courage buried in the sands of history. A woman refusing to bow before her captors, another smuggling food to a dying fighter, a few who managed to flee the city under the chaos of rebellion. These moments, though fleeting, remind us that even in the darkest corners of empire, the human spirit fought to survive. The Romans recorded their victories, but not the quiet bravery of the enslaved. Yet in every fragment of bone unearthed from the Colosseum soil, there is a trace of that endurance. As the empire grew, so did its need for spectacle. The games became grander, bloodier, more elaborate. Emperor after emperor used them to distract the masses from corruption and poverty. Bread and circuses, they called it. Feed the people and keep them entertained, and they will never question your rule. The captives paid the price. Ships from conquered lands brought thousands to Rome. Gauls, Carthaginians, Greeks, Britons, Jews. Among them, women with faces weary from travel, children clinging to them, eyes wide with terror. They were sold at auctions, their destinies decided by a raised hand and a handful of coins. No one asked their names. No one cared where they came from. The empire devoured them all. Those who entered the Colosseum never forgot the sound. The ground trembled as 50,000 voices roared, a wave of sound that swallowed everything human. It was said the first scream in the arena was the loudest, the moment when a person realized their end was no longer theirs to choose. Captive women often waited just beyond the gates, tending to dying fighters, carrying away bodies, cleaning the blood from the sand. The smell clung to them, the metallic tang of death seeping into their clothes and skin. Even after years, they said they could still taste it in the air. That was their world, a world built on despair, disguised as glory. Sometimes, the emperors would declare a damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. Prisoners and slaves were thrown to lions and bears, torn apart for entertainment. Women were not spared. Though history tries to soften the details, the truth remains. To be condemned to such a fate was to face terror so complete that even death seemed merciful. But before that final moment came the waiting, the endless waiting in dark cells, listening to the roars above, knowing that the crowd would cheer when your turn arrived. That waiting, that anticipation of horror, was its own kind of torture. Yet even as Rome thrived on this cruelty, cracks began to appear. Philosophers started to question the morality of the games. Some citizens turned away, disgusted by the bloodlust. Early Christians, often themselves persecuted, spoke of compassion and mercy, ideals that clashed with the empire's thirst for control. Among the captives, whispers of rebellion grew. A few gladiators, inspired by the legendary Spartacus decades earlier, dreamed of freedom again. And among the women, quiet faith took root, the belief that one day this world of chains would fall. The fall did come, though not in a single day. Centuries later, when the Colosseum stones began to crumble, nature itself seemed to reclaim what humanity had corrupted. The vines that grew over its arches became symbols of forgiveness, of time erasing cruelty. But even now, when tourists walk its corridors, the air carries echoes. You can almost hear the cries beneath the cheers, the silence between heartbeats, the memories that refuse to die. The captive women of Rome left no monuments, no statues, no inscriptions. Yet their suffering lingers in every shadow cast by that great ruin. To call their fate worse than death is not exaggeration, it is truth. Death ends pain. What they endured continued day after day, without hope, without recognition. They were forgotten by history's chroniclers, but not by the stones of the Colosseum. Every step inside that place is a step upon their memory. They were the unseen, the unremembered, the cost of empire's glory. Even the gladiators, those symbols of strength and defiance, knew the weight of that truth. They fought because they had no choice, because survival was the only victory left to them. But many looked to the women who lived and served beside them, seeing in their endurance something stronger than steel. In their silence was courage. In their eyes a quiet rebellion. They bore witness to every cruelty, and yet they did not break. That endurance was their final act of defiance against Rome itself. When we speak of history, we often remember the victors, the emperors, the generals, the conquerors, whose names are etched in marble. But the real story of Rome lies in those it crushed, in the slaves who built its roads, the fighters who bled in its arenas, the women who endured its cruelty. They were the empire's invisible foundation, and their suffering, unspoken, unrecorded, is the shadow beneath its glory. What they experienced was beyond imagination, beyond words, beyond mercy. For them, death was not the enemy. Life itself had become the battlefield. And yet, in remembering them, we give them back what Rome took away, their humanity. We speak their truth, not to glorify pain, but to understand it. To see how easily power corrupts, how entertainment can turn to atrocity, how civilization can mask barbarity. The Colosseum still stands, not as a triumph of architecture, but as a warning. Its arches may gleam in the sunlight, but beneath that beauty lies a history written in suffering. The captive women of the gladiator age did not die in vain if we choose to remember them, not as victims, but as witnesses. Witnesses to the darkest depths of human cruelty and to the unbreakable endurance of the human spirit. Their story is not just Rome's story, it is humanity's story. A reminder that every empire built on pain eventually crumbles, that every spectacle fades, that every forgotten soul deserves remembrance. In the silence that follows the last cheer, in the dust that settles over the empty arena, their presence lingers, and if you listen closely, beneath the echoes of history, you can still hear them whisper, not in fear, but in defiance. They whisper of freedom,